My security camera recorded this last night. Nothing strange at first. But pause the clip and count the faces in the window. There should only be 3 people in the house. So why are there 4?
This is a true horror story about a video I was never supposed to watch. Most people actively browse the internet late at night looking for a fictional scary story to experience a brief, entertaining, and completely safe thrill before turning off their bedside lamps and comfortably drifting off to sleep. But when the impenetrable walls of your private sanctuary are quietly and inexplicably breached, and you capture the absolute proof of that violation on digital tape, it becomes a terrifying reality that permanently and violently shatters your core understanding of the natural, logical world. My name is Mark, and for the past 5 years, my wife, our young son, and I have lived in a sprawling, slightly outdated, single-story craftsman house located at the very end of a deeply isolated, heavily wooded suburban cul-de-sac. We moved here specifically for the profound, undisturbed peace and quiet, entirely seeking a comfortable, secure sanctuary heavily insulated against the chaotic, noisy demands of the outside world. The neighborhood is completely surrounded by thick, towering acres of ancient pine trees, creating a massive, natural, impenetrable barrier that effectively swallows any ambient noise from the distant, winding highway. For years, our home was a perfect, quiet haven. But recently, a creeping, inexplicable feeling of heavy dread began to slowly take root in the very bottom of my stomach. After a brief string of minor, unexplained burglaries and strange nighttime trespassing incidents reported in the surrounding, adjacent neighborhoods, I decided to take a completely rational, logical step to ensure the absolute safety of my family. I purchased a high-definition, motion-activated, infrared indoor security camera and firmly, meticulously mounted it high up in the deepest, shadowed corner of our open-plan living room. I carefully and deliberately angled the wide, unblinking glass lens downward to perfectly capture the entire expanse of the room, ensuring that the wide field of view covered the heavy front door, the large, comfortable sectional couch in the center of the floor, and the massive, floor-to-ceiling glass window that stretches across the entire back wall and looks directly out into the pitch-black, sprawling backyard. The camera was entirely silent, a tiny, unobtrusive black dome that silently recorded every single movement to a massive, encrypted local hard drive stored securely in my home office down the hall. I genuinely believed that this simple, modern piece of technology would provide a deep, comforting sense of security and permanently silence the screaming, primal survival instincts that had recently begun echoing in the back of my exhausted brain. For the first few weeks, the camera captured absolutely nothing but our mundane, quiet, daily routines, documenting the utterly normal life of a standard family of 3. But that fragile, comforting illusion of absolute safety completely dissolved when I decided to randomly audit the digital archives late last Thursday night. I was sitting completely alone in the pitch-black darkness of my home office, the only source of illumination in the suffocating room being the harsh, pale blue glow of my computer monitor heavily reflecting against my pale, sweating face. The house was entirely, completely silent, the kind of heavy, static, heavily pressurized silence that violently pops your inner eardrums and makes the cold, stagnant air feel impossibly thick and incredibly difficult to breathe. The rest of my family was deeply, peacefully asleep in their respective bedrooms down the long, narrow, dark hallway. I randomly clicked on a specific digital video file from 3 nights prior, a highly mundane, completely silent recording of my family spending a quiet evening together. The high-definition security camera footage showed exactly what I expected to see. The digital timestamp glowing brightly in the bottom right corner of the screen displayed exactly 10:14 p.m. The 3 of us were sitting closely together in the dark living room, completely relaxed and entirely focused on the large television mounted on the opposite wall. The room was bathed in the faint, shifting, pale blue glow of the television screen, casting long, jumping, highly distorted shadows across the pale walls and the polished hardwood floorboards. My wife was sitting on the left side of the large sectional couch, her head resting heavily and comfortably against my right shoulder. I was sitting perfectly still in the middle cushion, my arm casually draped behind her. Our 7-year-old son was sitting cross-legged on the thick, woven area rug directly in front of the heavy wooden coffee table, completely mesmerized by whatever bright, colorful movie was playing on the screen. It was a picture of absolute, undisturbed suburban normality, a deeply intimate, quiet moment frozen perfectly in the silent, black and white digital recording. The massive, floor-to-ceiling glass window located directly behind the sectional couch acted exactly like a massive, dark mirror in the pitch-black night. Because the backyard outside was completely swallowed by absolute, impenetrable darkness, the thick glass perfectly and clearly reflected the glowing television screen and the backs of our three heads. The ambient atmosphere inside the recorded footage was incredibly calm, slow, and completely devoid of any chaotic movement or sudden noise. But as I sat there in my cold, isolated office, my dry, burning eyes completely locked onto the glowing monitor, the heavy, ambient atmosphere inside my own home fundamentally, violently, and irreparably shifted. Something felt wrong, but I couldn't explain it. A profound, ice-cold dread began to pool heavily in the very bottom of my empty stomach, entirely paralyzing my freezing lungs and turning the tensed muscles in my trembling legs into solid stone. The natural, comforting, ambient background noises of my old craftsman house slowly began to completely, inexplicably fade away into absolute nothingness. The low, familiar, mechanical hum of the kitchen refrigerator compressor abruptly and violently cut out. The rhythmic, gentle, natural settling creaks of the wooden walls completely ceased. The entire sprawling property was violently plunged into a deafening, heavy, static void of absolute, terrifying silence. I leaned extremely close to the glowing monitor, my clammy, sweating hands gripping the smooth edge of my wooden desk so tightly that my knuckles turned completely, painfully white. I focused entirely on the silent, black and white digital footage playing smoothly on the screen, desperately trying to identify the exact source of the intense, primal anxiety aggressively washing over my exhausted body. I closely observed the small, mundane details of the recorded scene. The flickering light from the television danced across our pale faces. The relaxed, completely motionless body posture of my wife leaning against my shoulder. The absolute stillness of my son sitting on the rug. Everything looked perfectly, flawlessly normal. But that wasn't the worst part. As I continued to stare blankly at the silent recording, a creeping, highly unnatural anomaly slowly began to violently assault my rapidly fracturing mind. It was incredibly subtle at first, a microscopic, almost imperceptible inconsistency in the visual data that only a deeply paranoid, exhausted mind would ever notice. That's when I noticed it. The massive, dark reflection cast upon the heavy, floor-to-ceiling windowpane directly behind our couch was not behaving according to the immutable laws of physics and light. The flickering, pale blue light from the television screen seemed to heavily and accurately bounce off the thick glass, perfectly illuminating the reflected backs of our three heads, but the deep, suffocating shadows pooling densely in the absolute darkest corner of the reflection, right behind the highest point of the sectional couch, did not match the physical bodies sitting in the room. There was a dense, heavily concentrated patch of absolute, static darkness in the reflection that completely refused to shift, warp, or react to the changing, flickering light of the television screen in the exact way a normal, natural shadow absolutely should. The reflection of the television light seemed to be slightly, terrifyingly delayed when it passed over that specific, dark spot in the glass, exactly as if the light were actively hitting a solid, three-dimensional, physical mass that was completely absorbing the ambient illumination. My rational, desperate, logical mind instantly and violently tried to explain the terrifying anomaly away. I forcefully tried to convince my breaking sanity that it was simply a bizarre digital glitch, a severe, highly localized compression error in the cheap security camera footage. I told myself it was just a strange, distorted pixelation caused by the low light conditions, or perhaps a heavy glare from the television bouncing aggressively off a dirty smudge on the thick window pane. I tried to rationalize that the heavy, dark mass in the reflection was simply the bulky, awkward shadow cast by the tall floor lamp standing perfectly still in the corner of the room. I desperately wanted to believe that the creeping, sickening realization violently anchoring my heavy body to my desk chair was nothing more than a severe case of pareidolia, an exhausted human brain frantically trying to find recognizable patterns and threatening shapes in completely random, meaningless digital static. I took a deep, violently trembling breath, my tight, cramping lungs desperately gasping for the freezing, thin indoor air, and slowly dragged the digital progress bar backward by 20 seconds. I wanted to replay the exact same silent sequence, entirely convinced that watching the footage a second time would perfectly and logically resolve the terrifying visual inconsistency and allow me to finally go to sleep. I pressed play, my wide, unblinking eyes locked intensely onto the dark, reflective glass of the window in the background of the footage. The silent video repeated. The three of us were still sitting completely motionless on the couch, entirely unaware of the invisible digital camera quietly recording our every single microscopic movement from the high, shadowed corner of the ceiling. The television light flickered brightly, casting sharp, jumping silhouettes across the walls. But the heavy, dense, absolute shadow in the reflection did not dissolve. It did not magically morph back into the innocent shape of a tall floor lamp, and it absolutely did not break apart into random, meaningless digital pixelation. Instead, the horrific, statuesque stillness of the dark anomaly became profoundly, terrifyingly clearer. The physical environment inside the recorded living room felt incredibly, impossibly heavy, completely saturated with a deeply malevolent, unseen presence that was actively bleeding directly out of the glowing monitor and heavily infecting the stagnant air of my dark office. I could physically, undeniably feel the intense, overwhelming psychological pressure radiating violently from that specific, dark spot in the reflection. It was an overwhelming, crushing, deeply physical weight that actively squeezed the precious oxygen right out of my chest, making the frantic, uneven, terrified, booming hammering of my own heartbeat sound deafeningly, impossibly loud in the pitch-black, isolated room. I reached out with a cold, violently shaking hand and aggressively clicked the mouse, completely pausing the silent video frame at exactly 10:14 and 32 seconds. The black and white image completely froze, locking the three of us in a permanent, static state of complete and utter vulnerability. I stared intensely at the heavy, dense shadow reflected in the cold glass directly behind my wife's resting head. This is a true horror story that permanently strips away every single rational defense mechanism you possess, forcing you to confront the absolute, terrifying truth that your safe, quiet home has never truly belonged to you at all. The shadow was far too dark, far too solid, and entirely too structured to be a simple trick of the shifting light. It possessed distinct, physical dimensions, a towering, heavy width that completely dwarfed the physical size of my own sitting body, and it was positioned far too close to the back of the couch. The absolute, mind-shattering realization that the dark mass in the reflection was not an object, but a physical, standing presence, sent a massive, freezing shockwave of pure, toxic, blinding adrenaline tearing straight down my spine. The deeply terrifying detail was that this massive, unseen entity was completely, perfectly hidden from the direct, physical line of sight of the security camera lens by the tall, bulky back of the sectional couch. If it hadn't been for the massive, floor-to-ceiling glass window acting as a perfect, dark mirror behind us, it would have been entirely, completely invisible in the footage. But the reflection did not lie. It captured the undeniable, impossible truth that we were completely, helplessly trapped in our own living room with something ancient, unblinking, and entirely unknown. My breath was now forming thick, highly visible white clouds of condensation in the freezing air of my home office, instantly freezing and dissipating against the harsh blue light of the monitor. I was completely paralyzed by a pure, unadulterated primal dread, entirely terrified to move a single, violently aching muscle or to even look over my own exposed shoulder into the dark hallway behind me. I slowly, agonizingly leaned closer to the frozen screen, my dry, burning eyes desperately trying to pierce through the heavy, pixelated shadows to make sense of the towering, dark mass standing silently behind my family. The entity was standing perfectly, impossibly still, exactly like a forgotten, heavy stone statue deliberately placed in the absolute darkest corner of the living room. It did not possess any natural human movement, no subtle shifting of physical weight, no rhythmic bobbing of shoulders that would indicate biological breathing. It was simply a dense, solid, three-dimensional void that actively, hungrily absorbed the flickering, pale blue light of the television screen. As I stared deeply into the frozen, digital reflection, my rapidly fracturing mind began to slowly, terrifyingly pick out the deeply unsettling, highly unnatural shapes hidden within the heavy shadow. I could see the faint, incredibly subtle curve of an impossibly long, dark arm hanging completely limp and lifeless at its side. I could see the sharp, highly unnatural angle of a broad, structured shoulder leaning heavily and aggressively forward. But the absolute most terrifying, mind-breaking detail was completely obscured by the dense, pixelated darkness. I desperately needed to see its face, to know exactly what kind of impossible nightmare was standing mere inches away from the back of my wife's head, completely undetected by our natural, biological senses. I forcefully clicked the mouse again, slowly inching the video forward frame by agonizing frame, watching the flickering light of the television desperately attempt to illuminate the dark corner in the reflection. Every single microscopic, silent click of the mouse felt like a monumental, exhausting effort, my rational brain violently screaming at me to simply shut the laptop down and run blindly into the night. But a heavy, hypnotic, invasive compulsion forced me to keep watching the horrifying footage unfold. I kept watching the footage, over and over. Something was there. I just couldn't see it clearly yet. I sat completely frozen in the suffocating darkness of my home office, the only source of light being the harsh, pale, sickly blue glow of my computer monitor reflecting heavily against my pale, sweating face, entirely consumed by a terrifying, obsessive rewatch loop that was actively, violently tearing my fragile sanity to pieces. I had my trembling right hand tightly gripping the cold plastic of my computer mouse, my stiff index finger hovering over the digital playback controls, mechanically pressing the small rewind icon over and over and over again, completely trapped in a heavily pressurized cycle of pure, unadulterated primal dread. The digital security footage on the screen was only 45 seconds long, a completely silent, mundane, black and white recording of my family sitting on our large sectional couch late at night, bathed in the flickering, invisible infrared light of the motion-activated camera mounted high in the corner of our open-plan living room. I watched the digital timestamp in the bottom right corner of the video player silently tick forward from 11:41 p.m. to 11:42 p.m., my dry, burning eyes meticulously scanning every single grayscale pixel, desperately searching for a rational, logical explanation that my exhausted, panicked mind could accept. I noticed deeply unsettling, subtle patterns beginning to emerge in the silent footage the more I obsessively watched it, tiny, microscopic details that completely defied the natural laws of a secure, locked home. The heavy, thick, insulated curtains framing the massive, floor-to-ceiling glass window behind the couch seemed to possess a highly unnatural, completely static rigidity, while the pitch-black darkness pressing heavily against the exterior of the window pane didn't just look like the empty, vast expanse of our isolated, fenced-in backyard. The escalation of my terror grew exponentially with every single repeated viewing, because the deep background of the video looked fundamentally, horrifyingly wrong. The absolute darkness outside the glass felt impossibly dense, suffocating, and terrifyingly filled, exactly as if a massive, heavy, solid void was actively pressing its crushing weight directly against the fragile, cold glass, waiting patiently to be invited inside. The ambient atmosphere inside my home office aggressively plummeted in temperature, a bitter, biting, deeply unnatural chill violently radiating straight through the solid drywall and sinking directly into the marrow of my trembling bones, completely mirroring the terrifying, silent reality playing out endlessly on the glowing monitor. I desperately, pathetically tried to convince my rapidly fracturing mind that I was simply suffering from extreme sleep deprivation, that the creeping, sickening anomalies in the video were just standard, cheap digital compression errors or a bizarre trick of the complex, bouncing infrared lighting causing severe pareidolia. I needed an outside, objective perspective to ground my breaking reality, so I frantically clipped a tiny, 10-second segment of the silent video, attached it to a direct message, and sent it to my closest friend, a seasoned home security technician who intimately understood the complex visual quirks of cheap night vision lenses, desperately praying he would immediately text back with a boring, highly technical, entirely comforting explanation. I sat perfectly, rigidly still in the heavy, dead silence of my isolated house for exactly 14 agonizing, endless minutes, my frantic, uneven heartbeat violently hammering against my tight ribs exactly like a trapped, panicked bird, waiting for his digital response. When my phone finally buzzed against the hard wooden surface of my desk, the sharp, sudden vibration echoing incredibly loudly in the pressurized, suffocating quiet, I practically lunged forward to read the brightly illuminated notification screen. I eagerly opened his reply, fully expecting a long paragraph detailing shutter speeds and infrared light reflection, but instead, there was only a single, chilling, incredibly brief text message staring back at me. He didn't offer a logical explanation, he didn't reassure me that my family was perfectly safe, and he absolutely didn't dismiss the footage as a harmless visual glitch. The message simply read, "Pause the video, and count the faces." The creeping, sickening realization instantly and violently paralyzed my freezing lungs, sending a massive, freezing shockwave of pure, toxic adrenaline tearing straight down my spine and violently popping my inner eardrums. My trembling, clammy hand slowly reached back out toward the cold plastic mouse, my stiff fingers violently shaking as I dragged the digital cursor directly over the playback timeline, completely consumed by an overwhelming, crushing psychological pressure that actively squeezed the precious oxygen right out of my tight chest. I clicked the small pause button, violently freezing the black and white video frame at exactly 11:42 and 14 seconds p.m., the exact moment my friend had highlighted in his terrifyingly cryptic message. I took a deep, agonizing, trembling breath, forcefully holding the freezing air in my burning lungs, and began the slow, torturous counting sequence, perfectly obeying the horrific instruction. 1. I started with the most obvious, comforting shape in the foreground of the silent video, carefully looking at the small, illuminated profile of my 7-year-old son sitting peacefully cross-legged on the thick, woven area rug directly in front of the heavy wooden coffee table, entirely engrossed in the glowing television screen, completely oblivious to the dark, isolated world around him. 2. My wide, burning, dry eyes slowly moved upward, tracking the grayscale pixels to the large, soft cushions of the sectional couch, settling on the resting, peaceful face of my wife, her head tilted comfortably against the backrest, her eyes heavily lidded with exhaustion, feeling entirely, profoundly safe in the assumed impenetrable security of our locked, suburban sanctuary. 3. I shifted my terrified gaze slightly to the right, looking directly at my own pale, relaxed features in the frozen recording, watching myself staring blankly and mindlessly toward the flickering light of the television, a completely naive, foolish man who firmly believed that turning the heavy brass deadbolt on the front door was enough to keep the ancient, creeping horrors of the dark night firmly outside. Pause. I stopped breathing entirely, the deafening, heavy, static void of absolute silence violently crushing my home office, pressing a heavy, invisible weight against my mind as the terrifying reality of the situation began to slowly, agonizingly take deep root. Silence. I sat completely trapped in a single, infinite, heavily pressurized second of pure, unadulterated psychological agony, absolutely terrified to move my visual focus even a single, microscopic millimeter past the comfortable, established boundary of my sitting family. I knew, with absolute, mind-shattering, world-ending certainty, that if I forced my eyes to look into the dense, heavily shadowed background of the frozen frame, the fragile, comforting illusion of my safe, logical reality would be permanently and violently destroyed forever. But a heavy, highly unnatural, deeply hypnotic, invasive compulsion aggressively commanded my rigid neck muscles to hold perfectly still while my eyes slowly tracked upward, moving past the top edge of the couch and staring directly into the dark, reflective glass of the massive window behind us. The absolute realization violently slammed into my chest like a heavy sledgehammer, instantly shattering my fragile sanity into a million irreparable pieces. There are 4 faces. It was a terrifying, undeniable real experience that completely stripped away every single rational, logical defense mechanism I possessed, forcing me to accept that we were entirely, helplessly exposed. Standing perfectly, terrifyingly still in the absolute dead center of the frame, positioned directly behind the high back of the sectional couch, mere inches away from the resting, exposed back of my wife's head, was a 4th figure. It was barely visible in the harsh, high-contrast, sickly grey light of the infrared camera, its physical form masterfully, flawlessly blending into the heavy, suffocating darkness pooling densely in the back of the living room, but the pale, rigid features of its face were undeniably, horrifyingly clear. It did not possess the soft, biological textures of living human skin. Instead, it looked exactly like a smooth, unyielding, deeply hollow porcelain mask, completely devoid of any natural warmth, healthy flush, or earthly emotion. The entity showed absolutely no movement whatsoever in the frozen frame, entirely lacking the subtle, natural blurring that occurs when a living, breathing person naturally shifts their physical weight or takes a deep breath in front of a recording lens. It was completely, impossibly static, a towering, ancient, highly predatory void that had successfully, silently bypassed our heavy exterior locks, our glowing digital security system, and our primal survival instincts to stand perfectly still in the very heart of our secure home. The psychological pressure radiating violently from the glowing monitor was immense, an overwhelming, crushing, deeply physical weight that actively attacked my rapidly fracturing, exhausted mind, violently forcing me to confront a barrage of terrifying, impossible questions that entirely defied all natural logic. Why did absolutely no one react to its massive, freezing presence? How could my wife, sitting mere inches away from this towering, unnatural entity, not physically feel the intense, bitter, biting cold violently bleeding off its dark, shifting surface? How could my young son, whose innocent senses were usually so incredibly sharp, not hear the heavy, static, wet breathing that must have been echoing in the quiet room? Why did our large, protective dog not bark, completely failing to sense the heavy, toxic aura saturating the stagnant air? And perhaps most terrifyingly of all, why did the digital sensor of the cheap security camera successfully capture its impossible image when our own physical, biological eyes had completely, entirely failed to perceive it sitting right there in the living room with us? I desperately needed to see more, to violently force the blurry, grainy image to reveal the absolute truth of its dark existence. I reached out with a violently trembling hand and aggressively used the software's magnification tool, painfully zooming the digital video feed to 200%, then 300%, then an agonizing 400% directly onto the pale, unblinking face hovering in the shadows. The digital image immediately broke down into heavily distorted, chunky, chaotic gray blocks, the severe graininess of the cheap night vision lens swimming aggressively around the pale features, but the horrific zoom only served to reveal a truth so profoundly disturbing that it permanently poisoned my existence. The digital distortion wasn't just a byproduct of low resolution, the heavy, jumping static seemed to actively swirl and vibrate directly around the entity, exactly as if its deeply unnatural, highly malevolent presence was aggressively interfering with the electromagnetic field of the camera itself. And as I stared deeply into the pixelated, hollow voids where its eye should logically be, a cold, sickening wave of pure, unadulterated nausea washed violently over my entire trembling body. The figure feels completely, terrifyingly aware. It wasn't just blindly facing the television or passively observing the backs of our heads, the sharp, impossible angle of its rigid porcelain face was tilted slightly, purposefully upward, staring with terrifying, absolute mathematical precision straight into the hidden lens of the security camera mounted high in the corner. That's when things changed. The horrifying realization that it actively knew it was being recorded completely destroyed any lingering, pathetic hope that this was just a mindless, wandering paranormal echo or a residual haunting. It was highly intelligent, profoundly patient, and entirely aware of the modern technology capturing its dark shape, intentionally allowing its terrifying visage to be digitally immortalized so that I would eventually sit exactly where I am sitting right now, entirely alone in the freezing dark, paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of my own helplessness. I couldn't explain it. Living through a true horror story actively strips away your ability to rationalize the world, replacing your comforting logic with a raw, screaming, animalistic fear that entirely consumes your soul, forcing you to constantly check over your own shoulder in your own locked house for the rest of your waking life. I slowly, agonizingly zoomed back out to view the entire, unedited frame of the living room, my dry, burning eyes desperately taking in the mundane, peaceful image of my sitting family, entirely unaware of the massive, unblinking predator looming silently in the shadows just inches away from their exposed necks. The heavy, pressurized silence in my home office suddenly felt incredibly, impossibly fragile, exactly as if the very same ancient, freezing entity from the video was currently standing directly behind my own heavy leather desk chair, patiently waiting for me to finally turn around and acknowledge its impossible existence. I forcefully squeezed my eyes tightly shut, completely terrified to move a single, violently aching muscle, entirely terrified to draw a single, natural breath, entirely consumed by the heavy, impossible truth frozen forever on the glowing digital screen. The fourth face was not supposed to be there. I could not bring myself to completely close the heavy plastic lid of the laptop. The pale, cold, grey light of the early morning sun had finally managed to break through the dense suburban winter fog, slowly creeping through the horizontal slats of my home office blinds and completely illuminating the small, previously dark room, but the suffocating, heavy, psychological darkness of the pitch-black night still violently clung to my violently trembling body. I was sitting perfectly, rigidly still in my worn leather desk chair, my tight, cramping lungs barely drawing in enough shallow oxygen to keep my exhausted brain conscious, my wide, burning, completely dry eyes locked in absolute, mind-shattering horror on the glowing computer monitor. I had just witnessed the live, high-definition security feed of my own seemingly empty, sunlit living room display 5 distinct, pale faces perfectly reflected in the dark, floor-to-ceiling glass window, a terrifying, visual impossibility that had completely and permanently destroyed the fragile, comforting illusion of my safe, heavily locked sanctuary. But human psychological denial is an incredibly powerful, deeply desperate biological defense mechanism. When you are suddenly, violently thrust into a terrifying real experience that fundamentally and irreparably shatters your core understanding of the logical, natural, physical world, your exhausted brain desperately scrambles to find any conceivable, rational anchor to actively prevent a total mental collapse. I forcefully swallowed the hard, dry lump of pure, unadulterated terror wedged deeply in my freezing throat, my clammy, sweating fingers gripping the smooth, black plastic of the computer mouse so incredibly tightly that my knuckles turned completely, painfully white. I aggressively, frantically clicked out of the live camera feed, completely plunging the digital video player back to the archived, local files list. I desperately told myself that the live feed was simply buffering incorrectly, experiencing a severe packet loss, or perhaps overlaying old, corrupted visual data onto the current stream due to a failing wireless connection. I needed to go back to the original, locally stored recording from Thursday night. I needed to meticulously, carefully, and obsessively analyze the exact moment this impossible nightmare began. I double-clicked the heavily compressed digital video file, the bright digital timestamp reading exactly 11:42 p.m., and watched as the black and white, infrared footage of my family sitting quietly on the sectional couch filled the glowing screen once again. For the first few agonizing minutes, the silent, static recording played exactly as I had originally remembered it. My wife's head was resting softly and peacefully on my right shoulder, my 7-year-old son was sitting cross-legged on the thick, woven area rug, and the pale, flickering blue light of the muted television cast long, jumping, distorted shadows entirely across the familiar room. I slowly decreased the playback speed down to a quarter of its normal rate, my burning, unblinking eyes intensely scanning every single microscopic, grey pixel of the dark reflection in the massive glass window located directly behind the heavy couch. I was desperately looking for the exact, specific frame where the fourth face had mysteriously materialized in the dark. But as I slowly, agonizingly scrubbed the digital timeline back and forth, dragging the small grey cursor across the bottom of the glowing screen, a new, deeply unsettling, impossible anomaly aggressively revealed itself to my rapidly fracturing sanity. The towering, pitch-black figure standing silently in the shadows behind my family was no longer entirely static. Between the individual, heavily compressed frames of the security footage, the dense, absorbing void was actively moving. It was an incredibly subtle, highly unnatural, deeply mechanical shifting that completely and entirely bypassed the normal, biological fluidity of human motion. At exactly 11:42 and 10 seconds, the pale, hollow, unyielding porcelain mask was hovering just inches behind my wife's head, exactly where I had first seen it when I initially paused the video. But when I dragged the cursor forward just 3 microscopic, agonizing seconds, the figure had silently, effortlessly shifted its physical position entirely to the left, positioning its towering mass directly behind my own resting head in the dark reflection. I quickly scrubbed the timeline backward, and the dark figure seamlessly returned to its original, right-sided position. I scrubbed forward again, and the massive, featureless shadow seemed to actively lean closer to the camera, the pale mask growing slightly larger, slightly more defined, and infinitely more menacing in the dark glass. It didn't take a physical step, it didn't mimic the natural bobbing of walking, and it completely lacked the subtle articulation of joints, it simply glided smoothly between the digital frames with a terrifying, absolute, physics-defying mathematical precision. A massive, freezing shockwave of pure, unadulterated primal dread tore straight down my spine, violently popping my inner eardrums with a sharp, sickening pain. I desperately, pathetically tried to convince my breaking mind that I was simply looking at a severe digital artifact, a common compression error inherently caused by the cheap, low-light infrared sensor of the basic security camera struggling to accurately process the chaotic, flickering television light against the highly reflective, dark glass surface. I logically rationalized that digital video data packets frequently drop or corrupt, creating overlapping, ghost-like composite images that easily trick the exhausted human eye into seeing distinct faces where there are only pixelated, shifting shadows. I told myself, over and over again in the heavily pressurized silence of my office, that this was not some terrifying scary story actively unfolding in my living room, but a mundane, easily explainable technological glitch that simply required a firmware update. I paused the video, let out a long, exhausted, violently trembling sigh that formed a faint cloud of condensation in the freezing indoor air, and completely closed the digital media player. I forced myself to stand up from the leather chair, my bare feet sinking painfully into the freezing, polished hardwood floorboards, and walked slowly over to the office window to look out at the quiet, sunlit suburban neighborhood, desperately trying to ground my panic in the warm, living, breathing reality of the early morning. I stood there for 10 full, agonizing minutes, listening intently to the distant, comforting sounds of early morning highway traffic and the gentle rustling of the bare oak trees, slowly and methodically convincing my rational, adult brain that my house was completely empty, entirely secure, and perfectly safe. But the heavy, intense, deeply malevolent presence pressing heavily against the stagnant air in my home office absolutely refused to fade away. It felt exactly as if the barometric air pressure in the small room had suddenly, aggressively dropped, pressing a heavy, invisible, crushing weight directly against my cervical spine. I was inexplicably, magnetically drawn back to the glowing laptop sitting open on my wooden desk. The dark, whispering, invasive compulsion aggressively commanded me to look at the footage just one more time. I sat back down, my right hand shaking so violently that I could barely control the plastic mouse, and I opened the security archive once again, double-clicking the exact same video file from Thursday night. The black and white footage buffered for a fraction of a single, highly pressurized second before playing. But the exact moment the video began, my heart completely stopped dead in my chest, a cold, sickening wave of pure, toxic nausea violently washing over my entire trembling body. The footage had fundamentally changed. It was the exact same digital file, the exact same timestamp, the exact same silent recording of my family watching television, but the dark, reflective window in the background no longer displayed for faces. There were 5. A second, completely identical, pale, hollow porcelain mask was now hovering silently in the pitch-black shadows directly next to the first one, its featureless, dark eyes towering menacingly over my young son sitting oblivious on the rug. I completely stopped breathing, my tight, cramping lungs physically burning for precious oxygen as the heavy silence of the house pressed against my ears. I violently closed the video file and immediately, frantically reopened it, entirely consumed by a blinding, screaming, animalistic panic. This time, the reflection in the dark glass showed only 4 faces, but the original, towering figure was now standing significantly closer to the couch, its massive pale mask completely obscuring the reflection of my own head. I closed and opened the digital file a third time, my mind completely breaking under the impossible weight of the reality collapse. Now there were 6 faces, a silent, unblinking, horrifying crowd of dense, towering shadows entirely filling the reflection of the massive glass window, completely surrounding my oblivious, sitting family in the freezing dark. The immutable, physical laws of digital data, recorded memory, and linear time were violently breaking down right in front of my wide, disbelieving, burning eyes. The security footage was absolutely not a fixed, static recording of a past, unchangeable event. It was completely, terrifyingly fluid. Every single time I watched the video, the dark entities actively shifted, multiplied, and aggressively repositioned themselves within the digital environment. The heavily pressurized, dead silence of the isolated house seemed to aggressively amplify the booming, terrified hammering of my own heartbeat, drowning out all logic and reason. I paused the highly corrupted footage one final, agonizing time, the glowing digital timestamp freezing permanently at exactly 11:44 p.m. The computer screen displayed a single, massive, pale mask completely dominating the entire dark reflection, hovering impossibly, terrifyingly close to the camera lens. As I stared intensely into the black and white pixels, the deeply unsettling, mind-breaking, impossible detail finally, undeniably revealed itself to my ruined sanity. The pale figure in the dark reflection was not looking at the physical backs of my family's heads. It was not looking at the glowing television screen. It was not even looking at the physical security camera mounted high in the corner of the living room. The hollow, unblinking, bottomless dark voids of the pale mask were perfectly, flawlessly aligned with the exact physical coordinates of my own face sitting in front of the laptop. It was looking directly at me. Through the recorded, compressed footage, completely across the temporal, impossible gap of 3 days, the ancient, malevolent entity was actively, patiently making direct, unbroken eye contact with me in the present moment. The creeping, sickening realization that the digital file was not simply capturing the haunting, but actively facilitating it, instantly paralyzed my freezing limbs and anchored me to the chair. The motion-activated security camera hadn't just passively recorded the dark entities standing in my living room, it had inadvertently created a bridge, a highly sensitive, two-way digital window that they were now actively using to observe my every single terrified movement. The horrifying, impossible twist violently slammed into my chest. The footage was actively reacting to being watched. The more I meticulously analyzed the dark shadows, the more I desperately replayed the silent, corrupted recordings, the stronger, vastly heavier, and significantly more present the entities became in my actual, physical, waking environment. I was entirely, helplessly feeding them with my absolute, unadulterated terror and my unbroken, obsessive, paranoid attention. The heavy, toxic, paranormal energy in my home office suddenly spiked to an unbearable, suffocating degree. The ambient temperature in the small room plummeted aggressively, my rapid, terrified breath forming thick, highly visible white clouds of condensation that instantly froze and dissipated against the cold, glowing laptop screen. I could physically, undeniably feel the intense, massive, freezing weight of an unblinking, pitch-black gaze firmly locked onto my rigid, vulnerable, exposed back. The dense, oppressive shadows pooling deeply in the corners of my office seemed to actively, aggressively lean inward toward my desk, perfectly mimicking the slow, mechanical glides I had just witnessed in the digital security footage. I slowly, carefully, agonizingly raised my wide, terrified eyes from the glowing computer monitor, completely terrified to move a single, violently aching muscle in my frozen neck. Directly in front of me, sitting quietly on my wooden desk just beside the keyboard, was a small, dark, completely inactive computer tablet, its glossy, black glass screen acting as a perfect, dark mirror in the dim, morning light of the office. The smooth, reflective surface perfectly captured the empty space directly behind my heavy leather chair. I desperately didn't want to look. My deep, ancient, primal survival instincts violently screamed at me to close my burning eyes, to run blindly out of the room, to completely abandon the house and survive at all costs. But the hypnotic, heavy, invasive compulsion forcefully pulled my gaze down to the dark, reflective glass. Reflected perfectly clearly in the smooth, black surface of the tablet, standing perfectly, terrifyingly still just inches behind my freezing shoulder in the real, physical, waking world, was the exact same pale, hollow, unyielding porcelain mask from the security footage. It wasn't a recording anymore. It wasn't a digital artifact or a trick of the light. It had finally, silently crossed over, seamlessly bridging the impossible gap between the static, pixelated screen and the heavily pressurized, suffocating silence of my isolated home. It did not breathe. It did not shift its massive weight. It simply hovered there in the freezing, stagnant air, staring intensely and malevolently at the back of my head, patiently waiting for me to finally turn around and surrender my completely broken sanity to the dark. I slowly reached my trembling hand out and completely pulled the laptop power cord entirely from the wall socket, forcefully slamming the plastic lid shut and plunging the monitor into absolute, dead darkness, but the heavy, crushing, freezing presence behind me absolutely did not fade away. I never turned around. I just sat there in the freezing office for hours, my eyes locked blindly ahead until the sun fully rose high into the sky, completely trapped in a waking nightmare that had entirely overwritten my reality. We moved out of that sprawling, isolated suburban house less than a week later, leaving the expensive security cameras completely mounted to the walls and hurriedly abandoning absolutely everything we couldn't immediately pack into our cars. We never once spoke about the heavy, dropping barometric pressure, the freezing, unnatural drafts, or the intense, suffocating paranoia that had violently plagued our final, terrifying days there. My wife and young son simply assumed we were hastily fleeing the recent string of neighborhood burglaries, entirely, blissfully unaware of the absolute, impossible horror that had silently, patiently surrounded them on the couch that night. But some dark, ancient things do not just haunt the physical, wooden location of a house, they actively, aggressively attach themselves to the deeply traumatized, fractured minds of the isolated people who have unfortunately witnessed their true, impossible face. I am currently sitting perfectly still in the bright, warm, open living room of our brand new, heavily populated apartment, miles away from that isolated, dark suburban street. The television is playing softly and comfortingly in the background, and the bright afternoon sun is shining clearly through the large windows. My wife is sitting right next to me reading a thick book, and my son is playing quietly with his toys on the floor. It should be a flawless picture of absolute, undisturbed normality and complete, impenetrable safety. But there were only 3 people in that house. So why do I keep counting for, even now?